This is True Crime Stories for Sleep. In the dim light of a prehistoric dawn, humans lived at the mercy of their environment and each other. Long before cities, governments, or codified law, small bands of hunter-gatherers navigated a world filled with threats, predators, famine, and the constant uncertainty of survival. Violence, while often incidental, was sometimes deliberate, a calculated act against one's own species. Archaeological evidence suggests that the first acts of murder were not random accidents but expressions of rivalry, fear, and resource competition. Before we journey deeper into these early killings, if you are intrigued by the origins of human violence and the psychology behind it, make sure to subscribe, like, and comment where you're listening from. Understanding how our ancestors turned on one another provides insight into the biological and social roots of homicide, a story that spans millennia and shapes the human condition to this day. Now, let us step into a world where survival often meant navigating not just the dangers of nature, but the potentially lethal impulses of one's own kind. Archaeological sites across Africa, Europe, and the Near East reveal evidence of interpersonal violence dating back tens of thousands of years. Skeletons unearthed in regions such as Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, Naderik in Kenya, and Talheim in Germany show signs of intentional trauma, arrow wounds, blunt force injuries, and multiple paramortem blows. These victims were not casualties of random accidents. Forensic analysis suggests targeted attacks, often with lethal intent. At Jebel Sahaba, dated to around 13,000 to 14,000 years ago, archaeologists discovered 61 individuals buried together, many showing embedded projectile points and skull fractures. The site reflects what some scholars call the earliest evidence of systematic interpersonal violence. These were not isolated incidents, they point to repeated, deliberate conflicts between groups competing for limited resources such as water, hunting grounds, and shelter. Survival depended not only on skill and strategy but on one's ability to protect against threats from fellow humans. The Naderik site, even older at approximately 10,000 years ago, reveals 27 skeletons, including men, women, and children, many of whom suffered violent deaths. Some skeletons show signs of being bound or restrained, suggesting a coordinated attack rather than spontaneous confrontation. The presence of weapons embedded in bones indicates premeditation and intent. These discoveries challenge the notion of peaceful prehistoric societies, highlighting instead a complex interplay of cooperation and competition where lethal force could resolve disputes or assert dominance. Evidence from these sites also suggests that murder was often linked to social dynamics. Anthropologists argue that individuals or groups with greater access to resources were both targets and perpetrators. Conflicts may have arisen from disputes over hunting territories, food caches, or mating opportunities. In smaller bands, where social bonds were critical to survival, the betrayal of trust or the challenge to leadership could escalate quickly to fatal violence. Blunt force trauma to skulls and broken limbs, frequently observed in these remains, indicates that close-quarters confrontation was common. Unlike modern homicide, which often relies on firearms or concealed weapons, prehistoric killings required physical proximity, raw strength, and a willingness to engage in life-threatening risk. The victims were not only outmatched but also trapped in circumstances that left little room for escape. Some researchers suggest that the act of killing may have been ritualized in certain contexts. The positioning of bodies and the selective targeting of individuals hint at patterns beyond mere survival-driven aggression. In some cases, attackers may have sought to intimidate rival groups, consolidate power, or exact vengeance. The line between murder, warfare, and social control in prehistoric societies is blurred, but the evidence points to a deliberate, calculated understanding of lethal force. Beyond the act itself, the psychological motivations of prehistoric murderers are fascinating to consider. Anthropologists speculate that the same traits we see in modern offenders, competition for resources, fear, desire for social dominance, were at play. The cognitive capacity for planning, strategy, and understanding the lethal consequences of one's actions existed even in these early humans. Murder was both a survival tool and a reflection of the complex social instincts that have shaped human evolution. For the victims, survival was often a matter of luck, awareness, and physical capability. Anthropological reconstructions suggest that those who were alert, fast, or socially connected had a better chance of avoiding death. However, when confronted by superior numbers or armed aggressors, the chances were grim. Some may have fought back, attempting to defend themselves with weapons, while others were overpowered and left as grim warnings for their community. The social consequences of murder in these early communities cannot be overstated. In small bands where cooperation was essential, the loss of a single individual could impact hunting success, child rearing, or group defense. Murder disrupted not only the immediate circle of relationships, but also the stability of the band as a whole. Anthropologists suggest that early humans likely developed informal codes, taboos, or retaliatory practices to manage this inherent risk, laying the groundwork for the moral and legal frameworks that would emerge millennia later. Prehistoric killings also inform us about the evolution of justice and morality. The recognition of lethal intent, the social consequences of killing, and the need to regulate behavior among group members likely influenced early forms of social order. Even without written law, early humans may have enforced retribution, exclusion, or ritualized punishment to deter future violence. In this sense, murder was both a catalyst for social development and a measure of the limits of human cooperation. By examining these ancient cases, we see patterns that persist throughout history: conflict over resources, social dominance, revenge, and psychological drives. While the tools and context have changed, from clubs and stones to guns and knives, the underlying dynamics of human violence remain remarkably consistent. Prehistoric murders remind us that the capacity for lethal aggression is as old as humanity itself, embedded in both our biology and our social structures. Archaeological evidence further highlights the interconnectedness of violence and survival. In some cases, attackers may have sought to eliminate potential rivals before competition escalated. In others, murder may have been reactive, prompted by perceived threats or disputes within a fragile social hierarchy. The consequences extended beyond death. They influenced migration patterns, settlement choices, and even the evolution of social intelligence as groups learned to navigate danger collectively. As we step back and consider the first acts of deliberate human killing, it becomes clear that murder was never a simple phenomenon. It was a complex interplay of environmental pressures, social dynamics, psychological impulses, and survival strategy. These early acts set a precedent, demonstrating the duality of human nature, the capacity for cooperation and innovation alongside the potential for destruction. Ultimately, the prehistoric record serves as a stark reminder that violence and murder are not modern inventions. They are woven into the fabric of human existence, arising in response to threat, competition, and social complexity. By studying these earliest killings, we gain insight into the origins of human morality, law, and societal regulation, and we begin to understand the evolutionary and social contexts that shape the human approach to violence. The dawn of violence, then, is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a lens through which we can explore why humans kill, how societies respond, and what lessons can be drawn about survival, morality, and social cohesion. From the scattered bones of Jebel Sahaba to the strategic targeting observed at Nadirik, prehistoric murder provides a chilling yet illuminating window into the earliest human experience, and a foundation for understanding the trajectory of homicide across millennia. High in the rugged Ötztal Alps, on a glacier straddling the border of modern Austria and Italy, a man met an untimely end that would remain hidden for over 5 millennia. In September 1991, hikers discovered a remarkably preserved body encased in ice. Dubbed Ötzi the Iceman, he became an extraordinary window into the life and violent death of a Copper Age individual. His story, pieced together by forensic experts, paints a vivid picture of prehistoric murder and its implications for early human society. Ötzi lived around 3300 BC, a time when communities were small, mobile, and intensely dependent on hunting, foraging, and early forms of agriculture. Life in the Alps was brutal. Survival required skill, endurance, and vigilance against both the elements and rival human groups. Evidence from his remains shows that Otzi was a man accustomed to hardship. He carried tools, weapons, and provisions for long treks through the mountains. Yet, despite his preparation, he met a violent and unexpected end, one that speaks to the perennial presence of lethal conflict in human history. The first clues that Otzi's death was not accidental came from a small, seemingly inconsequential wound to his shoulder. Initial examination suggested an arrowhead had penetrated his left shoulder blade. Forensic reconstructions revealed that the arrow had severed an artery, a fatal injury in a world without medical care. His death, however, was not instantaneous. Analysis of the wound and associated trauma indicates he may have walked several hundred meters after being struck, seeking refuge before succumbing to blood loss. The nature of the attack implies deliberate intent. Otzi's assailant, or assailants, likely targeted him in a calculated act of violence rather than a spontaneous quarrel. The arrowhead, embedded deep in bone, suggests knowledge of weaponry and an understanding of how to inflict fatal damage. There are no signs of defensive wounds to his hands or arms, indicating he may have been ambushed from behind, caught unaware by a strike that left him little chance to react. But the story does not end with the arrow. Examination of Otzi's skull revealed additional injuries, including bruising and lacerations, consistent with a physical altercation. These secondary wounds suggest that the attack was not only lethal but personal in nature, possibly arising from a dispute over resources, territorial encroachment, or social tensions within or between groups. In a world where survival was a daily struggle, such conflicts could escalate to fatal outcomes quickly. Clues from his possessions provide further insight into the context of his death. Otzi carried a copper axe, a flint knife, and a quiver of arrows, tools that signify status and capability. His clothing, made of leather and fur, demonstrates an understanding of survival in extreme conditions. The fact that he was armed yet still fell victim to an attack underscores both the skill of his assailant and the unpredictability of violence in small, mobile societies. Even a prepared and experienced individual could be overpowered by a sudden, calculated strike. Researchers have debated the possible motives behind the murder. Some argue that Otzi may have been involved in a territorial dispute or feud. Others suggest interpersonal conflict, perhaps over leadership, property, or personal honor. The Copper Age, while primitive by modern standards, was socially complex. Communities had hierarchies, social norms, and alliances, and violations of these norms could provoke lethal retaliation. Otzi's death, in this context, may reflect both individual aggression and broader social dynamics. Chemical analyses of his stomach contents, pollen studies, and isotopic testing have also revealed details about his last days. He had consumed a high-protein meal, likely hunted game, and possibly rested in the valley before ascending into the high mountains. The presence of pollen from lower altitudes suggests he did not intend a long alpine journey. He may have been fleeing or traveling under duress. These subtle details create a picture of a man navigating both environmental and human threats in his final hours. The murder of Otzi also highlights the evolution of weapons and tactics. The arrow used to kill him was carefully crafted, with a leaf-shaped flint point and a straight wooden shaft, technology that required skill and knowledge. This level of craftsmanship indicates that early humans had not only the physical means but also the strategic understanding to carry out premeditated attacks, demonstrating that lethal conflict was a considered aspect of life even thousands of years ago. Forensic studies reveal that Otzi's death may have had multiple participants. The angle of the arrow, the absence of defensive wounds, and the location of the injuries suggest that the attack could have been coordinated. Ambushes, group disputes, or revenge killings may have been part of the social reality in which Otzi lived. Unlike modern societies where law enforcement mediates conflicts, prehistoric humans relied on force and cunning, making survival a constant negotiation between skill, speed, and social intelligence. Interestingly, Otzi's body also bears evidence of healed injuries. Broken ribs, a healed arrow wound to the shoulder, indicating he had survived previous violent encounters. This demonstrates a history of resilience and confrontation. suggesting that he was experienced in both conflict and survival. Yet even his experience was insufficient against this final, fatal assault. In this sense, Ötzi's murder encapsulates the fragility of life and the omnipresence of violence in early human societies. The study of Ötzi's death also offers insight into human social behavior and the emergence of justice. While we cannot know if his attackers were punished, the act itself would have sent signals within and between groups. Violence functioned not only as a means of survival but also as a social regulator, establishing hierarchies and enforcing norms in societies lacking formal institutions. The murder of a skilled, well-armed individual like Ötzi would have had profound consequences for group dynamics, alliances, and the perceived balance of power. Ötzi's death is a chilling reminder that human aggression is deeply rooted, emerging not only from immediate threats but also from competition, social pressures, and psychological drives. The combination of premeditation, skill, and opportunism seen in his murder reflects behaviors that persist across millennia. Conflict, rivalry, and lethal calculation are enduring aspects of human nature. Yet, in studying Ötzi, we also see the emergence of forensic awareness, centuries before formal science. Every wound, every arrow, every piece of clothing tells a story, allowing modern researchers to reconstruct not only the crime but the social and environmental context. Through these clues, Ötzi speaks across the ages, revealing the violent realities of a world where survival often meant turning on one another. In the end, Ötzi the Iceman is more than a frozen corpse. He is a historical testament to the earliest known instances of deliberate human killing. His story provides a unique lens through which we can understand the origins of murder, the strategies of early violence, and the social dynamics that have persisted through human history. The first known murdered human reminds us that conflict, strategy, and mortality are ancient companions of humanity, shaping the very fabric of society from its earliest days. In the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers cradled some of humanity's earliest civilizations, life was a delicate balance of agriculture, trade, and urban growth. Cities like Uruk, Ur, and Lagash were rising, and with them came not only innovation but conflict. While much of early history is reconstructed through artifacts and ruins, Mesopotamia offers a rare glimpse into the darker aspects of early urban life, the first written records of murder and deliberate killing. The earliest known records of homicide in Mesopotamia are found in cuneiform tablets, etched onto clay with reeds and preserved across millennia. These records are not merely administrative. They reveal the values, fears, and legal structures of a society beginning to codify human behavior. Unlike prehistoric killings, where intent is inferred from skeletal trauma, these texts explicitly describe acts of violence, the circumstances surrounding them, and the societal response. One of the most famous sources is the Code of Yarnamu, circa 2100 to 2050 BC, and later, the Code of Hammurabi, circa 1754 BC. These legal texts outline punishments for murder, often with remarkable specificity. For instance, one law states, "If a man commits murder, that man shall be put to death." The existence of such codified consequences suggests that homicide had become a societal concern, no longer merely a personal or familial matter but one with legal and communal implications. Archaeologists and historians have pieced together cases from these tablets. One account describes a man accused of killing his neighbor over a dispute about land boundaries. The record specifies the investigation, the testimonies of witnesses, and the final adjudication. What is striking is the formalized process. Even in the early 4th millennium BC, societies recognized the need for a communal response to violence, reflecting the emergence of early justice systems. In Mesopotamian cities, murder was intertwined with property, honor, and social hierarchy. Many cases involved disputes over land, livestock, or water rights. As the population grew and urban spaces became crowded, conflicts escalated from verbal arguments to lethal outcomes. Clay tablets suggest that social status influenced both motive and consequence. The killing of a high-ranking citizen often demanded stricter retribution than that of a laborer or slave, illustrating the stratified nature of early justice. Forensic evidence complements these textual accounts. Excavations in Ur and other early city-states reveal skeletons with clear signs of violent death, skull fractures from blunt weapons, embedded arrowheads, and defensive wounds. When paired with written records, these findings show that murder was not random or sporadic. It was an acknowledged part of life in dense urban environments, prompting societal mechanisms for deterrence and retribution. The Code of Hammurabi, in particular, codified the principle of lex talionis, the law of retaliation, often summarized as an eye for an eye. This principle demonstrates an early recognition of proportional justice. Murder demanded a direct and measured response. The intent was both punitive and preventative, signaling to the community that lethal violence would not be tolerated unchecked. Interestingly, these early records also hint at the psychological and social dimensions of murder. Many killings arose from anger, jealousy, or competition, echoing motivations still common today. For example, some tablets describe disputes over inheritance that escalated into homicide, while others recount acts of revenge following perceived slights. In these cases, murder was not merely a byproduct of survival but a tool for asserting power, settling scores, or enforcing social norms. The urban environment of Mesopotamia likely amplified conflict. Narrow streets, shared water sources, and communal living spaces increased interactions and tensions. In cities like Uruk, where thousands of people lived in close quarters, personal disputes could quickly escalate. Homicide in these settings was both a personal act and a reflection of the pressure of early urban life, illustrating that civilization did not eliminate violence but reshaped its forms. Mesopotamian records also show attempts to mediate conflict before it turned deadly. Some tablets reference fines or compensatory measures for injuries and property disputes, indicating that murder was considered a failure of social negotiation. Yet, when prevention failed, society imposed harsh punishment. These dual approaches, conciliation and retribution, reveal a sophisticated understanding of human behavior and the need to balance justice with social cohesion. The social implications of recorded murder in Mesopotamia are profound. The act of writing down crimes implies a communal concern, a recognition that violence affected more than just the individuals involved. Families, neighbors, and entire city districts were impacted by homicide, and codifying consequences helped maintain order. The emergence of written law marked a shift from reactive to proactive social control, laying the foundation for legal systems that would endure for millennia. Beyond law and order, the records highlight the ethical dimensions of early murder cases. Mesopotamians grappled with questions of intent, culpability, and fairness. Was a killing accidental or deliberate? Did social status matter? Were witnesses reliable? Tablets often detail investigations and witness statements, showing that early societies sought to balance truth, justice, and deterrence, long before modern forensic science existed. The archaeological context also provides clues about enforcement. In many urban centers, dedicated spaces for judicial activity, public proclamations of guilt, and ritualized punishments suggest that murder was not only a legal concern but a moral and communal issue. Public awareness of consequences reinforced societal norms and underscored the gravity of taking a life. Mesopotamia's approach to murder demonstrates continuity with both prehistoric and modern times. While the methods, tools, and context evolved, the core human dynamics, conflict over resources, social rivalry, and the moral weight of killing, remained constant. Written records, in contrast to skeletal evidence alone, offer a unique window into how humans conceptualized violence, justice, and social responsibility. In examining these earliest written accounts, it becomes clear that murder was not merely an isolated act but part of a broader social fabric. It influenced law, governance, social hierarchy, and moral reasoning. The transition from unwritten prehistoric violence to codified legal response represents a major milestone in human civilization, showing how communities sought to regulate behavior, deter aggression, and protect collective interests. From the first crude records and clay tablets to the sophisticated legal frameworks of later civilizations, ancient Mesopotamia stands as a testament to humanity's early attempt to understand, document, and control the darkest impulses. Murder was recognized, feared, and managed, not eliminated, but shaped by societal norms, legal authority, and cultural priorities. By analyzing these records, modern scholars gain invaluable insight into both the practical and philosophical dimensions of early homicide. The motivations, methods, and societal reactions reveal patterns that echo through history, illustrating the timeless interplay between human aggression and social order. Ancient Mesopotamia, in recording its first known homicides, not only confronted mortality but also began the long human journey toward justice, law, and ethical reflection. In the ancient narratives of humanity, murder is not only recorded in bones or tablets, but also enshrined in story. One of the earliest and most enduring tales is that of Cain and Abel, preserved in the Hebrew Bible and later echoed across cultures and religions. Unlike forensic evidence or cuneiform records, this account exists in myth, yet it illuminates early human contemplation of jealousy, morality, and the consequences of killing. The story, set in the earliest generations of humanity according to tradition, presents Cain, the elder son, a farmer cultivating the land, and Abel, a shepherd tending his flock. Both brought offerings to God, Cain from the fruits of the soil, Abel from the firstborn of his flock. The narrative emphasizes that Abel's offering was favored, sparking envy and resentment in Cain. Scholars suggest that the tale is less about literal events and more about the psychology of violence, how rivalry, perceived favoritism, and emotional turmoil can escalate to lethal action. Before delving further, it's important to understand that the Cain and Abel narrative functions as a societal mirror. While prehistoric murder and Mesopotamian records show the mechanics of killing, this story explores moral reasoning, ethical boundaries, and the human capacity for remorse. In a way, it bridges the gap between action and reflection, illustrating how communities sought to understand and teach the gravity of homicide. Cain's response to perceived injustice was extreme. In a moment of anger and jealousy, he lured Abel into the field and struck him down. This act of fratricide, the first of its kind in the biblical text, represents a transition from mere survival-driven violence to morally laden murder, an intentional act driven by emotion, envy, and social comparison. Unlike prior prehistoric or Mesopotamian cases, this killing carries symbolic weight. It is not just the taking of life but a moral failing with lasting consequences. The immediate aftermath of Abel's death emphasizes the societal and cosmic repercussions of murder. God confronts Cain, asking, "Where is your brother Abel?" Cain responds with the famous line, "Am I my brother's keeper?" This rhetorical question captures a profound ethical dilemma that resonates through millennia. What responsibility does one human have to another? It is one of the earliest recorded explorations of accountability, culpability, and the moral dimensions of homicide. Punishment follows quickly. Cain is cursed, condemned to wander the earth, and the soil he tills will no longer yield abundance. This punishment is symbolic and functional, reflecting early human society's understanding that murder disrupts not only personal relationships, but also the stability of the community. Unlike Mesopotamian codes, which prescribe specific physical penalties, the biblical account emphasizes social and spiritual consequences, revealing a different dimension of early homicide discourse. The story also reflects cultural attitudes toward justice and deterrence. Cain is marked by God to prevent others from killing him, illustrating the concept of protective sanctions, a precursor to ideas of state-sanctioned justice or social regulation. While prehistoric and early urban killings relied on retaliation or tribal enforcement, the Cain and Abel narrative frames murder within a cosmic order, signaling to listeners or readers that violence is both morally wrong and socially destabilizing. Jealousy and emotional impulses are central to the story. Anthropologists and psychologists note that the narrative captures universal themes: rivalry for status, fear of inadequacy, and the human struggle with uncontrolled anger. Cain's act is intentional and premeditated, demonstrating that the psychological components of murder, envy, resentment, and impulse control failure, have been recognized since humanity first reflected on its own actions. The narrative structure also serves an educational purpose. By framing the murder of Abel as a cautionary tale, the story warns future generations of the consequences of unchecked emotion and ethical failure. Ancient societies often used myth to codify values and social norms. Cain's fate exemplifies how murder violates not only personal bonds, but also cosmic and communal order. In this sense, the tale acts as a cultural law, teaching morality through narrative rather than clay tablets or written statutes. Interestingly, the story of Cain and Abel is not isolated in human mythology. Across cultures, early myths frequently depict sibling rivalries, jealousy, and lethal conflict. Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and later Greek myths echo similar themes, highlighting that humans have long grappled with the emotional, social, and moral dimensions of murder. Cain and Abel thus represent a universal archetype, a lens through which ancient people understood the causes and consequences of human violence. The field where Abel was killed becomes symbolic, a liminal space where personal motives intersect with larger moral imperatives. Scholars suggest that this motif, removing the victim from the domestic or communal environment, mirrors real-world patterns in early human murder, where conflicts often escalated in isolated or transitional spaces. It is a subtle reminder that location, circumstance, and opportunity have always shaped lethal encounters. Cain's wandering after punishment also highlights the societal dimensions of murder. In small, closely knit communities, taking a life could disrupt labor, alliances, and family structures. Exile or marking, as in Cain's case, reflects early attempts to mitigate the social consequences of homicide while preventing cycles of retaliation. By integrating moral, social, and cosmic dimensions, the story communicates a holistic understanding of murder's impact, beyond the act itself. From a modern perspective, Cain and Abel illuminate the psychology of first murder narratives. The interplay of emotion, social comparison, and perceived injustice reflects enduring human patterns. Whether in prehistoric skirmishes, Mesopotamian disputes, or modern interpersonal homicide, the motives, envy, fear, rivalry, remain consistent. The story thus provides a bridge between myth, moral reflection, and historical behavior, offering insights into both early cognition and societal values. Moreover, the tale of Cain and Abel set a precedent for later legal and ethical frameworks. By codifying the idea that murder carries consequences, spiritual, social, and personal, the narrative prefigures legal codification and moral philosophy. In Mesopotamia, homicide became a matter of state law. In biblical thought, it became a matter of divine justice. Together, these strands reflect humanity's evolving response to violence, demonstrating both the continuity and transformation of ethical reasoning over millennia. The story also touches on themes of prevention and societal learning. By presenting the murder as a cautionary tale, ancient authors conveyed the dangers of jealousy, unbridled emotion, and failure of responsibility. Communities could internalize these lessons, understanding that murder damages not only the immediate victims, but also the broader moral and social order. This narrative approach complements archaeological and legal records, emphasizing the role of storytelling in early human regulation of behavior. In sum, the story of Cain and Abel illustrates the intersection of human emotion, societal norms, and moral reasoning in the earliest recorded narratives of murder. Unlike the blunt trauma of prehistoric victims or the procedural accounts of Mesopotamian law, this myth situates homicide within ethical and spiritual dimensions, providing a framework for understanding human violence in its psychological, social, and moral complexity. The tale endures because it addresses timeless questions. Why do humans kill? How should society respond? What are the moral consequences? By examining this earliest narrative, we see that even millennia ago, humans recognized the multifaceted nature of homicide, grappling with both practical consequences and ethical imperatives. Cain and Abel thus remain a cornerstone in the study of human violence, bridging prehistory, early civilization, and moral philosophy. Along the banks of the Nile, where fertile waters nourished crops and civilizations flourished, life in ancient Egypt was both structured and fragile. The pharaohs ruled with divine authority, temples and tombs rose in monumental glory, and cities bustled with artisans, merchants, and laborers. Yet beneath the veneer of order, murder was a grim reality, entwined with ambition, jealousy, and power struggles that would leave traces for archaeologists and historians to uncover millennia later. Ancient Egypt's approach to violence was shaped by a combination of religion, law, and social hierarchy. The Ma'at, the concept of truth, balance, and cosmic order, underpinned daily life and governance. Acts of murder were not simply crimes against individuals. They were transgressions against the divine and societal order. Killing a fellow human disrupted the equilibrium of the community and the universe itself, demanding punishment and ritual response. Archaeological evidence provides insight into the prevalence and nature of murder. Skeletal remains from various sites show clear signs of violent trauma. Blunt force injuries, cuts consistent with knives or axes, and multiple perimortem wounds indicate deliberate homicide rather than accidental death. In some cases, the method of killing suggests premeditation, such as victims restrained or ambushed in secluded areas. These physical traces align with textual evidence, revealing a society that both recognized and recorded acts of lethal violence. The legal framework of ancient Egypt addressed murder through both codified law and royal edict. While the oldest surviving legal texts are fragmentary, court records and inscriptions indicate that murder was punishable by death or severe retribution. The methods of adjudication varied. Local magistrates could administer justice, and the pharaoh's officials often intervened in cases affecting state order or prominent families. This dual system highlights the integration of civil authority and religious morality in regulating violence. High-profile murders often involved political intrigue. Pharaohs and nobles were frequent targets of assassination attempts, reflecting the precarious nature of power. One notable example is the death of Amenemhat I's brother, which some scholars speculate may have been politically motivated. Such killings were not only personal attacks but statements of ambition and control, demonstrating that murder in ancient Egypt extended beyond domestic or local disputes to the realm of statecraft and succession. Common citizens were not exempt from lethal conflict. Evidence from workers' villages, agricultural settlements, and towns like Deir el-Medina indicates disputes over property, inheritance, and labor occasionally escalated to homicide. Clay ostraca and papyrus records document conflicts resulting in death, often accompanied by legal proceedings. These accounts show that violence was a social reality, not limited to elite circles, and that the mechanisms of justice sought to mitigate both personal vengeance and broader societal disruption. Ritual and religious practice also shaped responses to murder. The concept of Ma'at required balance. Thus, unpunished killing threatened cosmic order. Funerary texts and tomb inscriptions emphasize the importance of justice, sometimes invoking divine intervention against the guilty. Victims were often commemorated in ways that reinforced societal norms, honoring the dead while warning the living of the consequences of transgression. In this way, murder was both a legal and moral violation, blending the earthly and the spiritual. Certain high-profile cases offer insight into motivations. Jealousy, rivalry, and ambition were common drivers. Workers competing for status or access to scarce resources sometimes resorted to lethal force. Religious officials, too, could be caught in disputes over temple authority or sacred property, leading to fatal outcomes. These killings were rarely impulsive. They reflected calculated attempts to secure advantage or eliminate rivals, revealing human behavioral patterns consistent across time and geography. Weapons in ancient Egypt were both tools of survival and instruments of murder. Knives, axes, and clubs, often used in daily labor, could be turned against fellow humans. Archery was a refined skill among the military, and bows could deliver lethal precision. Skeletal remains frequently show injuries consistent with these implements, providing forensic evidence of targeted, intentional killing. The use of such weapons underscores the deliberate nature of many homicides and the inherent risks of communal living in both urban and rural environments. Societal response to murder involved both punishment and reconciliation. Royal decrees, local courts, and informal restitution practices all contributed to maintaining order. In some cases, offenders were executed; in others, compensation or labor might be required. These practices highlight the Egyptians' awareness that murder disrupted not only immediate social bonds, but also the stability of larger communities. By addressing homicide through structured mechanisms, they attempted to prevent cycles of retaliation and maintain societal harmony. The intertwining of murder with religion and cosmology is particularly striking. The Egyptians believed that unchecked violence offended the gods and could bring misfortune upon the community. Rituals of purification, offerings, and symbolic justice were often employed to restore balance. Funerary practices emphasized protecting the deceased's Ka spirit from further harm, reinforcing the idea that murder had consequences beyond the physical realm. In this sense, killing was not only a social crime but a cosmic disruption demanding rectification. Comparing murder in ancient Egypt to earlier societies, such as Mesopotamia, reveals both continuity and evolution. While Mesopotamian law focused on retribution and property disputes, Egyptian society added a profound spiritual dimension, linking human actions to divine order. Violence was recognized as a threat to communal, legal, and cosmic equilibrium, showing an advanced understanding of the multifaceted impact of homicide. In examining Egyptian murder cases, patterns emerge that mirror universal aspects of human behavior. Ambition, jealousy, revenge, and resource competition drive lethal conflict across time. Whether in prehistoric hunter-gatherer bands, Mesopotamian city-states, or the streets and courts of Egypt, the motives for murder remain consistent: survival, status, power, and emotion. The methods, social context, and response may change, but the underlying human dynamics persist. Archaeology and textual evidence together provide a rich portrait of murder in this era. Tomb inscriptions, papyri, and skeletal remains form a mosaic that highlights both individual tragedies and societal responses. For every high-profile case of political intrigue, there are countless ordinary victims whose lives ended violently, leaving traces of human vulnerability, social regulation, and moral contemplation. Ultimately, the study of murder in ancient Egypt demonstrates how law, morality, religion, and society intersected to address the darkest facets of human behavior. Homicide was not merely an act of personal violence. It was a disruption of order, a moral failing, and a challenge to communal stability. By codifying consequences, invoking divine authority, and memorializing victims, ancient Egyptians sought to reconcile the inevitability of conflict with the need for justice and balance. Through the lens of these early murders, modern scholars gain insight into the human condition. Violence, whether driven by emotion, ambition, or survival, has been a persistent feature of societies throughout history. Ancient Egypt, with its structured governance, religious frameworks, and cultural emphasis on balance, illustrates how early civilizations attempted to understand, regulate, and mitigate the effects of homicide, a theme that continues to resonate in legal and ethical discourse today. By the early 1st millennium BC, the Mediterranean world was transforming. City-states, polis, such as Athens, Sparta, and Corinth were emerging, and with them, complex legal systems, civic structures, and philosophical inquiry. In these fledgling communities, murder was no longer merely an act of survival or revenge. It was a matter of civic concern, legal codification, and moral reflection. Ancient Greece provides a critical window into the evolution of homicide from instinctual or ritualistic behavior to a subject of ethical and legal debate. In Athens, homicide was addressed through both religious and civic channels. The Greeks believed that murder offended not only the victim and their family but also the gods, especially the Erinyes, or Furies, deities who pursued those who shed kindred blood. To kill was to disrupt both social and cosmic order. Families of the deceased often sought revenge, but the state began to intervene, recognizing that unchecked cycles of vengeance could destabilize the polis. The first legal codifications regarding murder appear in early Draconian law, circa 620 BC. Draco, an Athenian legislator, instituted some of the harshest penalties in Greek history, including death for even minor offenses, though murder was treated with particular severity. His laws addressed both intentional killings and accidental deaths, distinguishing between voluntary homicide, hekusios, and involuntary homicide, akusios. The differentiation reveals an early attempt to classify human intent, a concept central to modern jurisprudence. Involuntary killings, such as those resulting from negligence or accident, were often resolved through fines or exile, rather than execution. Voluntary murder, however, demanded stricter punishment. Trials for homicide were conducted in public, often before assemblies or panels of citizens, blending legal process with communal oversight. This public adjudication served multiple purposes. It punished the offender, reassured the community, and importantly, reinforced civic norms. Greek drama and mythology also offer insight into societal attitudes toward murder. The story of Orestes, who avenged his father Agamemnon by killing his mother Clytemnestra, illustrates the tension between familial duty, revenge, and emerging legal frameworks. Orestes' trial before the Areopagus, the Athenian Council of Elders, is often cited as a symbolic origin of trial by jury, highlighting the early Greek attempt to balance personal justice with societal order. Murder was not merely physical, it was moral, legal, and symbolic. Philosophical reflection on homicide began to emerge during this period as well. Thinkers like Hesiod and later pre-Socratic philosophers pondered the human propensity for violence, the role of divine justice, and the ethical responsibilities of individuals. Hesiod's works and days warns of the consequences of anger, envy, and transgression, while early thinkers emphasized the importance of rationality and self-control in preventing destructive acts. Murder, therefore, was not only a legal issue but a subject of ethical discourse, reflecting the Greek preoccupation with virtue, arete, and the proper conduct of life. Archaeological evidence complements textual sources. Human remains from Greek settlements show trauma consistent with interpersonal violence, including stab wounds, blunt force injuries, and arrow strikes. While not all killings were ritualistic or politically motivated, patterns suggest social tensions, competition for resources, and personal rivalries played central roles. In urbanized polis environments, where population density and economic interdependence increased, murder was both a personal act and a disruption to the collective. The role of intent in Greek law is particularly significant. Distinguishing between accidental and deliberate killings required sophisticated investigation, testimony, and communal judgment. Witnesses, often family members or neighbors, were crucial in reconstructing events. In some cases, ritual purification or exile served as restitution, emphasizing that the consequences of murder extended beyond punishment to restoring social and spiritual equilibrium. The interplay between law, religion, and morality illustrates a multidimensional approach to homicide, far more advanced than prehistoric or early Mesopotamian responses. Sparta, with its militarized society, had a different relationship with homicide. Violence was normalized in military training, and killings in combat were valorized, yet civilian murder was strictly regulated. Even in a society dominated by martial values, murder outside sanctioned contexts, over jealousy, theft, or personal rivalry, was punishable, reflecting a dual morality, sanctioned violence versus socially destructive homicide. The coexistence of these norms demonstrates early recognition of context and intent in adjudicating killings. Economic and social factors also influenced homicide patterns. Wealth disparities, land disputes, and familial inheritance conflicts often escalated into lethal confrontations. For instance, property quarrels between neighbors could result in violent deaths, while disputes among artisans or merchants sometimes had broader political ramifications, especially in smaller city-states where social cohesion was fragile. Greek law and philosophical commentary address these issues, emphasizing both justice and the maintenance of civic order. Literature and plays from this period underscore the psychological complexity of murder. In tragedies by Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, characters grapple with guilt, divine punishment, and societal condemnation. The portrayal of remorse, moral dilemma, and familial impact illustrates that Greeks understood murder as a human, emotional, and ethical phenomenon, not merely a legal infraction. These narratives reveal an emerging awareness of the internal consequences of killing, anticipating later philosophical and psychological explorations of violence. By the 5th century BC, the Greek approach to murder had evolved into a sophisticated system balancing law, morality, and societal interest. Homicide was addressed through legislation, adjudicated through public courts, framed by religion and myth, and analyzed philosophically. The Greeks recognized that violence could not be prevented by law alone. Ethical education, civic engagement, and ritualized acknowledgement of wrongdoing were equally crucial. The cumulative effect of these innovations was the creation of a society that understood murder not only as a personal crime but as a disruption to the polis and cosmic order. Whereas prehistoric killings were survival-driven and Mesopotamian homicides were regulated largely through codified retribution, ancient Greece introduced a multi-layered understanding encompassing law, ethics, public accountability, and philosophical inquiry. It is in this context that homicide became a topic of civic discourse and moral reflection, setting a foundation for later Western legal and philosophical thought. Ultimately, the Greek engagement with murder illustrates humanity's growing capacity to reflect on violence, categorize intent, and incorporate ethical principles into legal frameworks. Violence was recognized as inherent to human nature, yet civilization sought ways to mitigate, adjudicate, and understand it. From forensic observations of injuries to public trials and literary explorations of guilt and retribution, ancient Greece offers a remarkable lens into the intellectual, legal, and moral dimensions of early homicide. The streets of early Rome were a stage of ambition, rivalry, and expansion. From the modest beginnings of a hilltop settlement along the Tiber, Rome transformed into a republic and eventually into an empire, and with this growth came both opportunity and violence. Murder, once an individual or tribal matter, became a public concern, governed by law, precedent, and societal expectations. In Rome, homicide was a lens through which law, morality, and politics intersected, reflecting both the sophistication and brutality of the civilization. Early Roman law, codified in the 12 Tables, circa 450 BC, addressed murder directly. The tables set clear distinctions between voluntary and involuntary homicide, providing specific remedies and punishments. A voluntary killing, intentional and deliberate, was punishable by death or exile, while involuntary homicide could be resolved through fines, purification rituals, or compensation to the victim's family. This legal framework demonstrates Rome's understanding of intent and context, an advance on the Mesopotamian and Greek systems. Rome's approach to murder was deeply entwined with social hierarchy. Killing a fellow patrician carried consequences not only for the offender but also for political stability. High-profile murders, such as those involving senators or magistrates, were treated as threats to the state, requiring investigations, trials, and sometimes public spectacles of punishment. Conversely, crimes against slaves or lower classes, while still punishable, often carried lighter penalties, revealing the intersection of power, privilege, and law in Roman society. One of the most famous examples of politically motivated murder was the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. While far later than the early Republic, the event encapsulates the Roman approach, a murder with political intent, executed with precision, and resulting in societal upheaval and debate about justice. The conspirators, though motivated by fear and ambition, invoked the idea of protecting the Republic, highlighting the enduring tension between personal gain, moral justification, and societal impact. Beyond politics, Roman records and literature suggest that domestic murders were not uncommon. Household disputes over inheritance, property, and honor often escalated into lethal violence. The Digest of Justinian and earlier commentaries reference cases in which family members killed each other, sometimes in defense, sometimes in jealousy or rivalry. These incidents reveal that human motives, envy, greed, fear, remained consistent across centuries, even as the mechanisms for adjudicating murder became more sophisticated. Punishment for murder evolved to reflect both deterrence and moral instruction. Public executions, sometimes brutal and theatrical, served as warnings to the populace. Methods included beheading, crucifixion, and throwing the condemned to wild animals in arenas. These punishments had multiple purposes: satisfying justice, deterring future crime, and reinforcing societal norms. In some cases, exile or confiscation of property served a similar function, particularly for high-ranking citizens whose deaths in public might destabilize communities. Religious and ritual considerations were also central. murder offended both human law and divine order. The Romans believed that improper killing could invoke the wrath of the gods, so purification rituals, sacrifices, and formal penances were often required for perpetrators, even when they were legally punished. Homicide was not simply a crime, it was a disturbance of cosmic order, reflecting continuity with earlier civilizations like Egypt and Mesopotamia, yet adapted to the Roman legalistic worldview. The evolution of Roman criminal law reveals an increasing sophistication in addressing homicide. By the 1st century BC, courts and magistrates meticulously distinguished between premeditated murder, manslaughter, and accidental death. Evidence, witness testimony, and circumstantial evaluation were employed to determine guilt and assign proportional punishment. The Romans understood that the social impact of murder extended beyond the immediate victim, affecting families, neighborhoods, and civic cohesion. Rome's urban environments further complicated the problem of homicide. Dense neighborhoods, bustling markets, and communal forums increased the likelihood of conflict. Economic disparities, political rivalries, and social tensions created fertile ground for lethal disputes. Archaeological evidence, such as skeletal remains showing stab wounds, blunt trauma, and defensive injuries, confirms that violent death was a tangible reality even amid the grandeur of Rome's public architecture. Literary accounts, from Livy to Tacitus, provide both narrative and analytical perspectives on murder. These texts often blend factual reporting with moral commentary, highlighting the ethical dimensions of homicide. Tacitus, for instance, describes killings within imperial families, noting both ambition and fear as motivators. Such narratives underscore that murder was as much a psychological and social phenomenon as a legal one, reflecting the complexities of human behavior within hierarchical and politically charged societies. Military culture also influenced the prevalence and perception of homicide. Roman soldiers were trained in lethal combat, and while violence was sanctioned on the battlefield, civilian killings remained punishable. The distinction between sanctioned violence and socially destructive homicide demonstrates the context-dependent morality of Roman society. Killing in the service of the state was valorized, while murder motivated by personal gain or malice was condemned. Family and inheritance disputes were another persistent source of violence. The Roman emphasis on patria potestas, the legal authority of the father over his household, created conflicts over property, status, and obedience. In some cases, these conflicts escalated to murder, illustrating how structural and legal hierarchies could inadvertently generate lethal outcomes. Even in structured societies, the tension between personal ambition and social regulation was a catalyst for homicide. Rome's legal and cultural approach to murder left a lasting legacy. The distinction between voluntary and involuntary killing, the emphasis on social responsibility, and the integration of ritual, law, and morality influenced later legal systems throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. By codifying intent, establishing public trials, and considering both punishment and deterrence, Rome advanced the civilizational response to homicide, bridging earlier societal practices with future jurisprudence. Ultimately, murder in ancient Rome was more than a crime. It was a disruption to the social, legal, and moral order. The Republic and later the Empire developed complex mechanisms for adjudicating, punishing, and understanding homicide, reflecting a society deeply aware of human violence and its consequences. Political, familial, and personal motives intertwined, while law, ritual, and ethics sought to restore balance. Rome exemplifies how civilization grapples with murder not merely as an act of death but as a catalyst for reflection, regulation, and societal evolution. Through Roman texts, archaeological evidence, and legal codifications, we can trace the evolution of homicide from survival-driven acts to crimes with moral, civic, and cosmic significance. The Romans, in systematizing justice, exploring intent, and integrating ethical reasoning, contributed profoundly to humanity's understanding of murder, its causes, consequences, and the enduring challenge of administering justice. Along the fertile banks of the Yellow River, early Chinese civilizations were taking shape. From the Xia dynasty through the Shang and Zhou, society was becoming increasingly stratified, structured, and literate. With these developments came the need to regulate human behavior, including acts of lethal violence. Murder, whether fueled by personal ambition, familial rivalry, or social tension, was increasingly seen not only as a moral transgression but as a threat to societal and cosmic order. Early Chinese culture emphasized harmony and balance, both within human communities and between humanity and the cosmos. The notion of Tian, heaven, and the mandate of rulers to maintain cosmic order meant that murder was not just a private act, it was an affront to the moral and spiritual framework of the state. Killing, especially when it violated family bonds or social hierarchy, could invite divine or royal retribution. The earliest recorded murder cases appear in a combination of oracle bone inscriptions, bronze vessel inscriptions, and later historical chronicles. The Shang dynasty, circa 1600 to 1046 BC, provides some of the first written accounts. Inscriptions suggest that killings, whether as punishment, revenge, or ritualized violence, were documented by royal scribes, indicating an awareness of both the act and its social consequences. Victims were often nobles, family members, or captives, reflecting both internal power struggles and societal hierarchies. Legal regulation evolved over centuries. By the Zhou dynasty, 1046 to 256 BC, the concept of ritualized justice and moral rectitude underpinned the treatment of homicide. Killing a member of one's family was considered especially egregious, as Confucian principles emphasized filial piety and the sanctity of familial bonds. Even early Chinese legal codes differentiated between intentional murder, accidental killing, and homicide committed in self-defense, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of motive and culpability. Case studies recorded in texts such as the Zhuizhuan and Shiji illustrate the complex interplay of personal, familial, and political motives behind murder. Ambition, jealousy, and revenge were common catalysts, particularly among aristocratic families vying for influence at court. One notorious example involves a court official who, out of envy, orchestrated the murder of a rival's heir, a crime documented in chronicles not only for its brutality but for its political consequences. Such cases underscore that murder in early China often intersected with power and governance, reflecting society's concern with both personal and state stability. Ritual and religion played a critical role in shaping responses to murder. Human life was considered sacred, but ritual observance and divination helped determine appropriate punishments. Oracle bones, used to communicate with ancestral spirits, sometimes recorded queries about killings. If X strikes Y, what will heaven say? Such inscriptions reflect a belief that murder carried consequences beyond human law, threatening cosmic balance and moral order. Archaeological evidence supports these textual accounts. Excavations of Shang and Zhou tombs reveal skeletons with injuries consistent with interpersonal violence, blunt force trauma, knife wounds, and multiple strikes indicating deliberate homicide. In some cases, these remains were associated with ceremonial sites, suggesting that murder could intersect with ritual sacrifice or political purging. The dual nature of these killings, both practical and symbolic, illustrates the complex social and spiritual dimensions of early Chinese homicide. The legal and moral frameworks in early China emphasized restoration of balance. Perpetrators of murder could face capital punishment, exile, or ritualized penance. Families of victims were often involved in the adjudication process, highlighting the role of social cohesion in enforcing accountability. By framing murder as both a personal crime and a societal offense, early Chinese authorities sought to prevent cycles of revenge while maintaining the moral integrity of the community. Political intrigue frequently motivated homicide in the royal courts. Assassinations, power grabs, and elimination of rivals were documented and sometimes ritualized. The Zhou concept of the mandate of heaven implied that unjust killings, particularly of rulers or their heirs, could destabilize the dynastic order, potentially provoking rebellion or divine disfavor. Murder was therefore not only a personal or familial concern but a threat to political legitimacy. Motive and intent were central to understanding homicide. Early Chinese law distinguished between impulsive acts, premeditated killings, and killings justified by defense or social duty. This early attention to psychological and situational context parallels developments in Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome, demonstrating a cross-cultural recognition of the complexity of human violence. Intent mattered, and justice systems sought to weigh it carefully, even in a society thousands of years old. Family-based murder, parricide, fratricide, and intra-household killings was particularly grave. Confucian ethics, though codified later, drew upon long-standing Chinese moral norms emphasizing the sanctity of kinship. Such acts were seen as not only socially disruptive but spiritually corrupting, invoking anger from ancestors and heaven itself. Punishments were therefore both punitive and symbolic, aiming to restore balance and moral integrity. The Chinese approach to homicide also highlights the tension between human ambition and societal stability. Wealth, rank, and political influence often created situations in which murder became a tool of strategy. Chronicles describe officials and aristocrats plotting against rivals, while peasant or laborer disputes occasionally escalated into lethal outcomes. Across social strata, the causes and consequences of murder were remarkably consistent. Competition, fear, greed, and envy remained universal human motivators. Comparing these cases with earlier societies illuminates the evolution of thought around homicide. Prehistoric killings were primarily survival-driven. Mesopotamian records emphasized retribution. Egypt added a spiritual and cosmic dimension, and early China integrated morality, family ethics, political order, and ritual into its understanding of murder. The interplay of law, religion, and ethics became a defining feature of early Chinese approaches, highlighting both continuity with and divergence from other civilizations. By 200 BC, the foundations for Chinese criminal thought had been firmly laid. Murder was codified, morally condemned, socially regulated, and ritually framed. Society recognized that lethal violence had far-reaching consequences, affecting not only the immediate parties but also familial, communal, and cosmic order. Early Chinese responses to homicide reflect a deep awareness of human behavior, ethical responsibility, and the necessity of structured justice. In essence, the first recorded murder cases in China reveal a civilization grappling with the same fundamental questions as earlier societies. Why do humans kill? How should society respond? What moral and spiritual consequences follow? Through law, ritual, and historical narrative, early Chinese civilization sought to answer these questions, creating a legacy of moral and legal thought that influenced millennia of subsequent governance and jurisprudence. Across millennia, the traces of early human violence have persisted not only in myth and text but in the very earth itself. From the late Paleolithic into the Bronze Age, burial sites offer compelling, if sometimes enigmatic, evidence of lethal conflict. Skeletal remains, tomb arrangements, and associated artifacts provide archaeologists and forensic anthropologists with clues to murders that predate written history, illuminating the social, ritual, and practical contexts in which humans took the lives of one another. One of the most striking patterns emerges from Neolithic settlements across Europe and the Near East. Excavations at sites such as Talheim in Germany, circa 5000 BC, reveal mass graves containing bodies with blunt force trauma to the skull, cut marks on bones, and positioning suggestive of violent death rather than ceremonial burial. In Talheim's case, nearly a dozen individuals, including women and children, were found piled together, their injuries indicating systematic killing. Anthropologists speculate that these deaths reflect intergroup conflict, whether for territory, resources, or retaliation. Similarly, in the Levant, Neolithic cemeteries at Jebel Sahaba in Sudan and Catalhook in modern-day Turkey reveal evidence of interpersonal violence. Projectile points embedded in skeletal remains, defensive wounds, and selective targeting of adult males suggest both warfare and targeted homicide. These findings emphasize that murder in prehistoric communities was intertwined with resource competition, social cohesion, and early forms of territoriality. Violence was not random. It often reflected strategic, culturally contextualized behavior. By the Bronze Age, circa 3000 to 1200 BC, mortuary practices began to preserve more detailed evidence of potential homicide. In Minoan Crete, skeletal remains from palatial settlements indicate trauma inconsistent with accidental injury. While ritual sacrifice has been debated as an explanation, many forensic anthropologists argue that the pattern of injuries, blunt force, fractures to the face and cranium, and defensive wounds, points to interpersonal killings within domestic or political contexts. These burials underscore that murder in early civilizations was not only a survival tactic but could also emerge from social, political, or ritual pressures. Across Asia, burial evidence corroborates the prevalence of lethal conflict in prehistoric times. In early Chinese sites such as Anyang, Shang Dynasty, and earlier Neolithic settlements, human remains sometimes display trauma from axes, knives, or blunt objects. The intentional nature of injuries is reinforced by body positioning. Victims were sometimes bound, face down, or placed in separate pits, suggesting execution-style killings rather than accidental death. The combination of forensic analysis and contextual archaeology allows modern researchers to reconstruct violent episodes with remarkable precision. In North America, mound builder cultures, circa 1000 BC onwards, also offer evidence of homicide. Skeletal remains in ceremonial mounds show trauma patterns consistent with interpersonal violence. Some burials include multiple victims, often accompanied by grave goods, while others appear to be deliberately excluded from ritual spaces, suggesting both violence and social censure. These findings illustrate that murder, and its social repercussions, was a global phenomenon, embedded in diverse cultural contexts long before written law. One of the most fascinating aspects of these archaeological cases is the intersection of murder and ritual. Some burials suggest that killings were part of ceremonial acts, possibly linked to status, appeasement of gods, or societal cohesion. In some Neolithic European sites, bodies with lethal injuries are interred alongside domesticated animals, weapons, or other symbolic items. Whether these killings were punitive, sacrificial, or politically motivated, the evidence demonstrates that the line between ritual and murder could be indistinct, and that violence carried both practical and symbolic weight. Forensic anthropology has been instrumental in clarifying these ancient acts. Skeletal analysis can reveal blunt force trauma, sharp force injuries, defensive wounds, and perimortem damage, distinguishing between accidental death, warfare, and targeted killing. For example, cut marks on forearms and defensive wounds on the backs of hands indicate that victims attempted to protect themselves, a signature of interpersonal murder rather than battlefield casualty. Similarly, repeated trauma to the skull, especially among women and children, often signals systematic targeting rather than random violence. Patterns in these burials suggest consistent human motives across time and geography. Territorial disputes, revenge, competition for resources, and social dominance emerge as recurring factors. In some cases, murder appears to be premeditated, evidenced by multiple blows, ambush positions, or binding of the victim. Even in societies without formal written law, early humans were aware of the consequences of killing, both socially and ritually, embedding notions of guilt, responsibility, and hierarchy into their interactions. The study of prehistoric murder also illuminates the evolution of human social organization. As communities grew larger and more complex, acts of lethal violence became less about immediate survival and more about maintaining power, enforcing social norms, or resolving conflicts. Elite individuals, emerging rulers, or dominant families sometimes orchestrated killings to consolidate authority or eliminate rivals, foreshadowing patterns observed in later civilizations like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and China. Archaeological burials also shed light on societal responses to homicide. Some victims were interred with care, suggesting ritual acknowledgement or reconciliation, while others were discarded or buried in mass graves, signaling social condemnation or fear of contamination. These differences indicate that early communities grappled with the moral and social ramifications of murder, even in the absence of formal legal systems. The treatment of bodies reflected cultural beliefs about justice, morality, and the maintenance of social and spiritual order. The archaeological record challenges modern assumptions about prehistoric violence. Once thought to be rare, Evidence now indicates that murder and lethal conflict were persistent and globally widespread, albeit shaped by environmental, social, and cultural conditions. From small hunter-gatherer bands to burgeoning Bronze Age cities, the human capacity for violence was present and recognized across diverse settings. Through these burials, researchers also observe patterns of gender and age in victims and perpetrators. Adult males often suffered injuries in the context of intergroup conflict, while women and children were more likely targeted in domestic disputes or acts of social coercion. Weapons used, placement of bodies, and trauma patterns reveal sophisticated knowledge of violence, indicating both intent and strategy. These cases provide insight into the complex social dynamics that underpinned early murder, far beyond mere survival instinct. Ultimately, archaeological case studies of murder burials reveal the continuity of human behavior across millennia. From the Paleolithic to the Bronze Age, motives, methods, and social consequences of homicide were remarkably consistent. Competition, ambition, revenge, and social regulation drove lethal conflict, while communities developed strategies, ritual, burial, and emerging law to address it. These silent skeletons, unearthed from ancient Earth, tell stories of conflict, consequence, and human adaptation that resonate through history. By studying these burials, modern researchers gain an unparalleled perspective on the origins, patterns, and societal responses to murder, bridging the prehistoric and historical worlds. They remind us that even in the absence of written law, humans grappled with the moral, social, and spiritual dimensions of taking life, a theme that reverberates in every civilization that followed. From the earliest scratches on clay tablets to the silent evidence preserved in ancient burials, humanity's engagement with murder is as old as civilization itself. Across millennia, patterns emerge, recurrent motives, consistent methods, and enduring social responses, illuminating the deep and troubling truths about the human capacity for lethal violence. While contexts, cultures, and legal systems evolved, the underlying impulses and societal consequences reveal a remarkably persistent thread. Murder is a phenomenon simultaneously personal, social, and universal. The earliest hominins, surviving in harsh, unpredictable environments, killed primarily out of necessity, for defense, food, or survival of the group. Evidence from prehistoric skeletal remains suggests that lethal aggression was sometimes indiscriminate, targeting rivals, intruders, or even members of the same group during periods of tension. As human societies became more structured, survival-driven violence intersected with competition for resources, status, and familial security, creating motives that extended beyond mere subsistence. By the time civilizations arose in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, homicide had become a regulated and codified act. Laws and social norms sought to manage murder not as an inevitability, but as a threat to communal stability. The Code of Yarnamu and later the Code of Hammurabi distinguished between intentional and unintentional killings, introducing concepts of compensation, retaliation, and divine oversight. These legal frameworks reflect an early understanding that while humans may be capable of lethal violence, society could mediate its consequences, mitigating chaos and restoring order. Patterns across cultures reveal common motives. Ambition and power emerge repeatedly as catalysts, whether in Mesopotamian dynastic struggles, Egyptian court intrigues, or Shang dynasty palace politics. Revenge is another persistent driver, recorded in texts, myths, and archaeological evidence, from Talheim's Neolithic mass graves to Homeric epics. Personal disputes over resources, status, and honor also fuel lethal conflicts. Even ritual killings, while culturally sanctioned, reflect structured approaches to addressing social tension and perceived threats. Across time, murder often served as a mechanism to assert control or restore perceived balance. The psychological dimensions of murder, though invisible in early records, can be inferred from repeated patterns of violence and social response. Injuries indicating defensive struggle, targeted attacks on family members, and systematic elimination of rivals suggest a capacity for premeditation, strategy, and awareness of consequences. Humans are capable not only of reactive violence but of deliberate, calculated killing, and societies recognize this complexity, imposing differentiated punishments based on motive and intent. Legal systems and moral frameworks reveal an evolving understanding of culpability and social responsibility. Ancient Greeks distinguished between voluntary and involuntary homicide, Romans codified intent in criminal law, and early Chinese societies integrated ritual, morality, and governance in adjudicating murder. Even in prehistoric contexts, burial treatments indicate communal awareness of culpability and social consequence. Across time, civilizations sought to balance the recognition of human violence with the need for social cohesion, creating mechanisms to deter, punish, and morally interpret homicide. Ritual, religion, and morality have consistently intersected with murder. In Egypt, killings could disrupt the divine order, while in China, murder offended both ancestral spirits and cosmic balance. In Mesopotamia and Greece, divine and social retribution intertwined, illustrating that humans have long perceived murder not merely as a crime but as an act with ethical, spiritual, and societal ramifications. These cultural responses underscore a universal acknowledgement of murder's destabilizing potential. Analysis of skeletal remains and archaeological evidence across millennia reveals persistent patterns of victimization and method. Men, often of fighting age, frequently fell in intergroup conflict. Women and children were vulnerable in domestic disputes and raids. Weapons, blunt instruments, knives, and projectiles, appear consistently across cultures and epochs, reflecting the practical realities of human violence. Defensive injuries indicate that victims resisted, suggesting awareness and agency, while mass burials and ritualized interments reflect broader social responses to lethal acts. Despite cultural differences, the human capacity for murder exhibits certain constants: the influence of self-interest, survival instincts, social hierarchies, and emotional drivers. Jealousy, envy, revenge, fear, and ambition appear repeatedly as motivating factors. Even when societies imposed strict laws, moral codes, and religious oversight, murder persisted, revealing a tension between human nature and civilizational control. The historical record demonstrates both the prevalence of violence and the ingenuity of societies in managing its consequences. Another striking pattern is the relationship between murder and social complexity. As communities grew larger and more hierarchically organized, lethal conflict became less about survival and more about power, property, and status. Elite families, rulers, and political actors often orchestrated killings to consolidate authority, while ordinary citizens sometimes engaged in murder over disputes of inheritance, property, or personal honor. This shift from survival-driven homicide to socially embedded murder highlights the adaptive and strategic dimensions of human violence. Throughout history, societies have developed layered approaches to homicide: legal adjudication, ritual purification, moral instruction, and public spectacle. From Mesopotamian compensation laws to Greek courts, Roman codices, and Chinese ritualized penalties, civilizations sought to contain, rationalize, and morally contextualize murder. Punishment was not merely retributive. It reinforced social norms, deterred future violence, and communicated communal values. Across millennia, humans demonstrated a consistent recognition that murder disrupts the social fabric, requiring deliberate management and cultural interpretation. The archaeological, textual, and philosophical record also highlights the ethical tension inherent in human violence. Murder challenges the boundaries of law, morality, and society. It is simultaneously a personal act and a social event, a violation of physical safety and moral order. Humans have long grappled with this duality, striving to prevent, adjudicate, and rationalize killings while acknowledging the persistent capacity for violence within their own species. Patterns observed over 12,000 years suggest that murder is both universal and adaptive. Across cultures, eras, and environments, humans have killed for the same fundamental reasons: survival, revenge, ambition, and social control. The methods vary, but the motives and consequences remain remarkably consistent. Societies, in turn, have consistently sought to regulate, punish, and morally frame these acts, creating enduring mechanisms to maintain cohesion and protect order. In conclusion, The historical and archaeological record demonstrates that murder is an intrinsic aspect of human behavior, shaped by environment, culture, and social structure. From prehistoric violence to codified legal systems, humans have sought to understand, prevent, and respond to homicide, reflecting both our capacity for destruction and our capacity for reflection. Patterns and motives persist across millennia, reminding us that violence is not merely an isolated act but a recurring challenge, one that civilizations have struggled to contain since the dawn of history. The story of murder, from the first prehistoric killing to the complex legal frameworks of ancient civilizations, is ultimately a story of humanity itself. Our ambitions, our fears, our ethical reflections, and our enduring struggle to balance instinct with civilization. In examining these patterns, we gain insight not only into history but into the timeless questions of human nature: why we kill, how we respond, and what it means to live in a society governed by both law and morality.